So this is, I believe, chapter 6. The title of it is osseous tissue. It's sort of, I said, when we talked about chapter 4, we said there's only 4 tissue types. So this is a form of connective tissue. It has all the characteristics of connective tissue that we've talked about, including lots of cells, cells that are spaced out, and there's a significant amount of what's called extracellular matrix. I can't. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the, once again, there's the prefixes and suffixes associated with the with osseous tissue. If you're talking about the prefixes first, there's the prefix osseo, osteo. There's also fibro and chondro. If you look at these prefixes, you'll see that they're, except for the first one, osseo, these prefixes are all repeated from chapter 4. Can you guys see this? Why is it so faint? In terms of the suffixes, so these are 4 prefixes off the top of my head. The suffixes come into 3 categories here. There's sites, there's class, and there's blasts. When you see the word blast, or the suffix rather, blast, you know you're building something. You're building a new material. I don't think we've talked about class yet. These, and the term that I'll be talking about in tomorrow will be, I think, or maybe today, osteoclass. So there's class. They're consuming. And then anything with the suffix site is a mature cell, and it's found in a lacunae, and a lacunae is a space. And again, the vocabulary from Unit 4, or from Chapter 4 rather, and this vocabulary, there's a significant amount of overlap here. In addition, if you go back to Quiz 2, there's anatomical terminology I'm definitely going to be using, and sort of directional terms, but there's also significant amounts of information. So there's the anterior portion of the elbow, it's called the antecubital region. The posterior part of the elbow is called the olecranon region. Right? Those terms are associated with the areas, but they're also associated with bones, and then also with the articulations. So Quiz 2 vocabulary is another thing to remember. And then there's a joint and an articulation, as we talked about last week in lab. This is when 2 or more bones come together. And typically we are talking about the proximal or distal ends of the bones. Also, you have to know about the bones that are either on the left side of the body or the right side of the body orientation. And that's whether the bone itself has a left or a right pair, or the bone, even if the bone is down the midline of the body, it's going to have a left side of the bone and a right side of the bone. It's going to have an anterior portion of the bone and a posterior portion of the bone. So think about vertebrae. You should be able to tell me what the types of, what side of the body we're talking about here. So there's going to be superior and inferior, anterior, posterior, left and right side of a vertebra, right? So again, you should be able to tell me all of that too. Why is this so? is so tiny? So I'm gonna use this big, hopefully this will be easier to see. Is that too big? Sorry. All right, so there's 6 types of bones, and when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about shapes. The one that is the most prevalent, or not prevalent, but the most obvious, are called long bones. And its opposite are short bones. So there's 6 shapes of bones. Of the last 2 have just some specific examples, and so they're very easy to talk about. First of all, a sesamoid bone has more than one, but for our context, it has just one example, and that's the patella. A wormian bone is also called a sutural bone. I don't remember if this book, sutural, talks about it being a wormian or a sutural. A sutural bone, is the name would indicate, it's a cranial bone, a skull bone that is found embedded in the sutures. So I might have a sutural bone and you may not, and it's completely natural. It's not a big deal. So these are between 2.
Let's say wormian?
Wormian. W-O-R-M-I-A-N. They're between 2 cranial bones. Flat bones come in a couple of varieties. The most obvious ones are bones of the skull, and also the sternum. Some skull and sternum. How about irregular bones? What would a classic example of an irregular bone be?
I don't know. Would it be your elbow? Like your humerus? Like a part of your humerus?
Well, no, so this is, what we're talking about here is we're talking about the entire bone shape. So the elbow or the humerus might have a weird part to it, but the entire bone is not irregular.
Maybe like your scapula.
So the scapula is a flat bone, but it's definitely a weird shape, but something along those categories. How about something more centrally located?
Pelvis?
Clavicle.
Something more centrally located than the pelvis and the clavicle.
Ribs.
Something more centrally located than the ribs.
Sternum.
Something more that posterior to the sternum. I already put the sternum down.
Xiphoid process.
Excuse me?
Oh, manubrium.
So posterior to the sternum. Don't say anything about the sternum or the ribs. Vertebrae. You guys are skipping over those completely. Some examples of short bones include, so depending on who you talk to, but generally carpals and sometimes metacarpals, but we're just going to say carpals. And then there's lots of examples of long bones, the femur being one of them. I'm going to talk about a lot of vocabulary associated with the bones and the parts of the bones. Generally speaking here, when we're talking about the bones themselves, so when you're something that is a projection, that projection can be a process, and this is not an exhaustive list here, so it's just an indication, a reminder, hopefully, that some of these terms here, a condyle, And when we get into the pectoral, the pelvic girdle rather, we're going to be talking about very substantial condyles there. Let's see here. Roughened projections will include tuberosities. So those are three major condyles, and again, let's see here. As I sit here, I can think more and more, so I'm gonna stop here at just these four. So anything that's sticking off of a bone can be a condyle, a process, a tuberosity, or a ramus. And those are, sometimes they can be specific to the bone, other times not. And then there's holes. Actually, wait a minute, I don't want to take a picture here. So a foramen and a foramina, one is big, one is little, but those are rounded structures that go through the bone itself. A fissure is a crack or a slit. A canal or a meatus are just a hole that goes from one side to the other. So those are some examples of vocabulary that you'll have to recognize. Some of these things, these projections, these holes are specific to bones. Other times they're more general. So the word condyle, you're gonna find the word condyle in lots of different places. But other words you might find just on examples on a specific bone. Now, what I wanna do is to start to draw sketch a little bit of a long bone, and then we're gonna start talking about some of the vocabulary associated with the long bone. Then I'm gonna mention a little bit about bone growth, and then I'll stop there. Okay, so the first thing I'm gonna try and do, and the operative word here is try. Let me see here, is to sketch out something that hopefully no laughing.
We're not laughing at your drawing. No laughing. That looks a little.
Is that supposed to be the
So,
femur?
what do you think this is supposed to be?
The femur.
Okay, so let's just say it's the femur, and I'll show this to Ms. Angel, and she'll laugh at it. But right now, what type of bone do you think it is?
Long bone?
Long bone.
So it's a long bone. Now, long bones in general will have specific areas of the body, I mean the bones themselves. So there's going to be an area right here. Actually, wait a minute, before I do this, let me take this out. I don't know why I put that bump there. Oopsie. All right. So there's going to be areas that are this blue area right here, and this blue area down here, these dotted lines. So you're going to divide the bone into three areas. Here's the main shaft, there's the area in the top, area in the bottom. The area in the top is an epiphysis. The area in the bottom is an epiphysis. So how do you distinguish between the two epiphyses? What anatomical term? Absolutely. Don't say anterior, posterior, left or right. What anatomical term? Associated with limbs. Distal and proximal. Which one is this one going to be?
That's gonna be distal.
Don't say proximal.
That's gonna be distal.
This has to be distal epiphysis. That's the proximal epiphysis. What does proximal mean? Proximal means closer, not superior, right? Closer to the point of attachment. Okay? So that's the proximal epiphysis. That's the distal epiphysis. And then if we were to continue on with this drawing here, this would be the proximal epiphysis, and then distal from there would be the distal epiphysis. So this is the distal epiphysis, that's the proximal epiphysis. This is called, this main shaft right here is called, does anyone know what this main shaft is?
Body.
So the diaphysis, the area that is in this blue dotted line and this blue dotted line right there is the area of bone growth, and it's called the epiphyseal plate. That epiphyseal plate will be cartilage until it's not. It's cartilage when you're young and you're growing. It's no longer cartilage when you're an adult. So you guys probably, there might be, the young men in this room might be growing still. Generally, women stop growing earlier than men. They mature earlier. So their epiphyseal plates will no longer, if you're fully grown, your epiphyseal plate will no longer be cartilage, it'll be ossified, it'll be complete bone. So there's that and that. In terms of bone growth, the bone growth is called, there's, for each long bone here, we have 2 epiphyseal plates or more, depending on the actuality. This is a sketch, right? So when we're talking about bone growth, we're talking about it growing in an oppositional way, so that the lengths of the bones, you add more bone to the, whoopsie. You add more bone to the distal portion of the distal epiphysis and more bone to the proximal portion of the proximal epiphysis, and as a result, it grows up and down simultaneously. Now, one of the things that you have to, this has to be coordinated, because if it's not coordinated, imagine that your right leg is growing faster than your left leg, right? That can be a problem. I have 3 brothers, and my oldest brother, when he was in about 4th grade to 5th grade, he had this disease called Legg-Perthes disease. His bones weren't ossifying at the same rate, and he had to stay off of his hip. And there's pictures of him playing baseball on crutches. So he would run with crutches, he would bat with crutches, and it just was sort of a thing that he had to do. So I'm going to show you some X-rays in lab of kids and people that have some conditions that sort of indicate this. And so this idea of, it's not a certainty that all these bones grow at the same rate. And in fact, most of your bones are probably not exactly the same length. So in other words, your left arm might be slightly longer than your right arm. I'm not talking about feet here. I'm talking about a matter of millimeters. Now, oops.
Is that why sometimes one foot is bigger than the other?
Yes. So now, if you take a cross section of the epiphysis, of the diaphysis rather, then, and it looks like a classic dog bone. So I'm going to clip it right here. I'm going to put it over here on the right. And it has a hole in there. And if you have a dog and given a dog bone, right, they try to get, if it's a dog bone from a store, right, then there's nothing in that hole. But if it's a dog bone from an animal, you'll notice that there's stuff inside of it. That bone marrow, right, is found in this black area right here. the medullary cavity. That medullary cavity has two different types of bone marrow depending on where you are. So on the diaphysis, there's either red bone marrow or yellow.
Wait, it's ULLARY? Is the
MEDULLARY. There's red bone marrow and there's yellow.
So the medullary cavity, just to confirm, is where the bone marrow is, right?
The yellow bone marrow. So the medullary cavity is that hole in the diaphysis, and you find stuff inside of it. There's, so depending on where you are, in the epiphyses, closer to the ends, either the proximal or distal, you'll see red bone marrow. In the diaphyses, you'll see yellow bone marrow. What does the yellow and the red indicate? It indicates different types of cells. So if it's yellow bone marrow, what type of cell is going to be found there?
what?
Yellow adipocytes?
So that if it's yellow bone marrow, it's going to be adipocytes, and if it's red bone marrow, it should be erythrocytes, right? So one of the things that when kids are growing, when they're toddlers and they're getting bigger and bigger, right? Oftentimes kids get sick all the time. I talk to Mrs. Gaspar all the time. How's her son doing? Oh, he's sick again. He's got this problem. He's got that problem. Well, his medullary cavities aren't very big, and they're not big enough to fight all his infections. So he has other alternatives. Right now, one thing in particular is called a thymus gland. So that helps fight infection, but it's not a very good thing. So as he's getting older and older, hopefully this is true of you. You were a kid. As a kid, you were sick a lot, and now hopefully you're not sick. And I'm not talking about sick with cancer. I'm talking about sick with colds and sniffles. You get this, that, and the other thing, right? The medullary cavity is a great place for bone production, bone marrow production rather, and red blood cells. And also its companion thrombocytes and leukocytes. So those thrombocytes and leukocytes are what help either stopping blood flow or fighting infection. So the red bone marrow is a great site of production for blood cells in hematopoiesis, and the yellow is for storage of energy. So red bone marrow, the process So hematopoiesis is blood cell production. Another way of saying that is that the prefix hemato means red blood cells. Hematocrit is the measure of the amount of red blood cells in your blood. So hematopoiesis immediately would say that you're making red blood cells, but you're also making other things too. You're also making thrombocytes and leukocytes. So hematopoiesis is technically, it's all blood cell production, but it includes erythrocytes, leukocytes, and thrombocytes. The large majority of hematopoiesis occurs in the red bone marrow in either of the epiphyses. There's also a blue layer around the inner part of the bone and the outer part of the bone. The prefix peri means surrounding the outer part of it. So it's peri, and if you look over here, when we were talking about, here it is, so I'm gonna use this word right here, osteo, okay, where that prefix, I'm gonna make it into a suffix though. So periosteum. So the periosteum, I'm going to tell you it comes in two layers, but right now it's a superficial layer of covering on the bone. And then there's also this blue layer that is surrounding the medullary cavity, and instead of the periosteum, it is the endosteum. So the endosteum surrounds the medullary cavity, the periosteum surrounds the diaphysis of the bone, or the superficial portion of the bone. Hey, Eliani, do me a favor, poke somebody to your neck. All right, so are there any questions about that?
Wait, the blue surrounding the little circle is endosteum?
The endosteum surrounds the medullary cavity, and so it is superficial to the medullary cavity, and it contains bone cells, and we'll talk about what they do in a second. So one of the things that I'm doing with this introductory portion, and when I go into, when we talk about joints and articulations, muscles and nerves, or the nervous system, I'm gonna do the same thing. One of the things I'm trying to do is to get you to anticipate what I'm gonna talk about. If you anticipate what I'm gonna talk about, then when I say it, hopefully it sticks in your mind. You can go back to these notes and say, oh, he just mentioned this thing and now he's saying it again. Maybe that's important, right? Hint, it is. Right? All of this stuff is definitely gonna be on the quiz and definitely gonna be on the exam. The trick for you guys is that when you get to next year and in future years, you have to do this yourself. Either retrospectively, say, listening to a lecture and going back and saying, what did they talk about? Or anticipatory, in other words, getting before the class, preparing for the class, taking notes like this from your lecture notes, and then saying, okay, which of all the stuff that I took, what's important? All right, they talked about this, they talked about that, they talked about this. All right, and then if you really are on the ball, then you can say to your faculty member, so this part right here, whoops, the distal epiphysis, you didn't talk about the distal epiphysis, or you didn't talk about the periosteum, and I know that that's in the notes, I know what that is that relevant to the class? And there's a number of different, that would be a great way to start a discussion with your faculty member, right? So my point here is that the time that we spend here, like all of this, I would never do down on the main campus, right? That's all on you. Next year, when you guys take AMP2, that's all on you. By the way, so I ran into two kids from, I think they're juniors now at Rick. And one of them is taking AMP2. She changed her major and she's going into the nursing school. She said to me, what's the hard, AMP2 is a lot of chemistry, it's hard. And I said, go back to the chemistry questions, go back to the cellular processes. So basically, go back to what you guys just finished. Right? And she's like, oh, do you think so? I said, absolutely, because that's all what we're talking about. Physiology is all based on cellular processes. All right, so are there any questions about this sort of basic introduction? All right, so we'll save this and then upload it to the Unit 2 notes. I won't take any more notes for this unit, so what we're going to talk about today and tomorrow is this chapter, whatever we finish on tomorrow. If we finish the whole chapter, it'll be on the quiz on Monday. If we don't, then whatever is missing won't be on the quiz, and we'll finish it on Monday. Next week, we're going to go through the entire skeletal system, and the following week we'll have the exam. Okay? Bet? All right. Joey, you got to sit up. Either sit up, stand up, or leave. What, this one?
Jeez. Jeez.
Those are my kids when they were like, I don't know, 8 and 10.
Do they get along now?
Do they get along now?
Did they get along then?
Yeah, they did. Although there's definitely stories. My daughter would do stuff like just piss him off.
Oh, my
and-
brother used to do stuff to piss me off.
Well, he was a lot bigger than her, so she was like, I'm never gonna fight him, so I'm gonna just piss him off. I'm just gonna get him really angry at me and then run away.
My brother,
And so she likes to tell stories about that.
my brother used to torment me. Oh my God. He's like 3.5 years older. He used to play baseball. He was a pitcher. He used to purposely step on my feet with his baseball cleats.
Ow.
I had so many bruises from that guy.
All right. So let's circle back here. Let's start now. So now the question is, out of everything that I'm about to show you, how many terms have I just used? Right? That's what I want you to start thinking about. Either today, we're not going to be talking a lot about the same stuff tomorrow. We're going to get onto something different. So in terms of the skeletal system here, or the lecture, or this lecture here, we have, this is an example of a cross-section of a bone here. The skeletal system includes bones, ligaments, and cartilage. When you're talking about ligaments and cartilage, the major protein that we're talking about here is collagen. In fact, when you're talking about bone, one of the major proteins associated with bone is collagen as well. Collagen is incredibly abundant here. This picture right here shows you different types of bones. Right here, this part right here, I didn't draw this part of the bone, and I forgot about that, so I have to, maybe I'll do that tomorrow. This part right here is called compact bone, and this part right here is called spongy bone. So there's different types of bone within an individual bone, and they have different jobs, they have different strengths and weaknesses. So we're going to talk a little bit about the functions and cells of the skeletal system, the bone types, this specialized vocabulary I mentioned a little while ago, some gross anatomy. Gross anatomy means, gross does not mean disgusting, it means big. So anatomy of things that you can hold in your hands, a little bit like what we've been doing in lab. And microscopic anatomy, and that's where we get into the specific details of individual bone cells and things like that. The third and fourth topics there, growth, fractures, and bone repair, and calcium homeostasis, those definitely will be for tomorrow. That calcium homeostasis is also related to yesterday's discussion when we're talking about vitamin D production and calcitriol. So the skeletal system itself, the system has to be strong, flexible. If it's too brittle, then your bones will break easily. If it's too strong, then your bones will be too heavy. So there's a number of things that the skeletal system has evolutionarily that keeps it hard and rigid, but flexible. So there's support is a major structure of the skeletal system. Obviously support goes, or protection goes with support, so it's protecting sensitive organs there. Bones, we don't move without muscles pulling it, and you need to pull on something, so there's a series of levers that our body makes, and those muscles and bones with articulations produce characteristic movement. I just mentioned just a minute ago about calcium storage and calcium negative feedback concentration. Really what we're worried about is the amount of calcium in the blood. If the amount of calcium in the blood is appropriate, then we can then start discussing whether or not there's enough calcium in the bones. If you're a normal healthy adult or young person like yourselves, probably have enough calcium in your bones and your blood. If you're much older, we'll talk about those consequences. And then we'll talk about this process right here at the very bottom here, hematopoiesis, incredibly important over the just sort of normal functioning of the body. So the cartilage is really critical to this, and cartilage is characteristic of connective tissue. The chondroblasts are the things that form the matrix. The chondrocytes are those cells that are mature and they're surrounded by lacunae. So regardless of whether they're an osteoclast, an osteocyte, is surrounded by lacunae. In this case, a chondrocyte is surrounded by lacunae. And the lacunae are in this case, we're talking about hyaline cartilage is the major cartilage. And again, that is the cartilage that one of the three cartilages that we've talked about already. The other two are fibrocartilage and elastic cartilage. Talk about the matrix of the cartilage and the matrix of the bone. That's basically the structure of the bone. You're writing on a table right now. The matrix of the table is supportive of your body and of everything that you're working with. So that matrix means something there. Prefix peri, again, surrounding the outside. So something chondrium. What are we talking about? Something on a superficial portion of the chondrium. What is chondrium? It's cartilage. So there's a dual layer surface of the cartilage here. There's two layers here. There's an inner and outer layer, and this is consistent with the skeletal system too. The inner layer is more delicate with cells, chondroblasts, and those chondroblasts of the perichondrium are going to be making new cartilage. Which cartilage? It depends on where you are in the body. Is it elastic, fibro, or hyaline? It's probably hyaline because hyaline is most abundant. The outer layer of the perichondrium is largely structural in nature. It's physical protection right here, and then there's also blood vessels and nerves. This type of cartilage is a different type of cartilage. It's not a type of cartilage in the sense that I have at the top there hyaline, fibro, and elastic, but as time progresses, and we're going to talk about bone maturity. So Mrs. Gaspar's son, I like talking about him. So when he was born, right, he didn't have a lot of articular cartilage because his bones were actively growing. The kid was growing like a weed. Right? Now, as he's starting to walk, the articulations are starting to form and they're starting to get stronger. And now the hyaline cartilage, which is what his long bones were particularly abundant about, are converting into articular cartilage. Articular cartilage will be at the ends of long bones, particularly. So then that means that they'll be either the proximal or distal epiphyses. I mentioned this oppositional growth there, or moving in opposite directions, and we'll talk more about that when we get into bones. But articular cartilage is the point where there's covering of the long bones at either the distal or the proximal epiphysis. If you look at this picture in the upper right here, here's sort of a classic picture of a bone growing. And here, this blue area right here and this blue area right there. One is the proximal and the other is the distal epiphysis. This end right here would be the articular cartilage. That end right there will be the articular cartilage. And if you look right here, that's labeled right. This is a young person's bone growing, and so there's the epiphyseal plates. I just drew one, but it's more complicated than that. And this on the right-hand side is an adult. You got adult, and this would include all of you, whether you're actually adults is another story, but probably you're not going to grow any taller than you are right now. So that means that the epiphyseal plates, which are now called epiphyseal lines, those epiphyseal plates or lines are ossified. So these plates are actually hyaline cartilage, this area right here, and this is compact bone. So when does bone growth stop? When the line, or the plate rather, forms a line and it ossifies into compact bone. The cartilaginous matrix is the structure of the cartilage. The bone matrix is the structure of the bone. The bone matrix has two major parts to it. There's organic and inorganic parts. And then there's a little bit of one final part, which is cellular. The organic part, I've mentioned collagen, I don't know how many times already. Collagen is hugely abundant. It's a huge portion of the bone matrix, and it's a strong and flexible portion of it. And so that's one portion of the organic part. This proteoglycans, this is a different type of protein here. But the inorganic part, now if you look at this thing right here, hydroxyapatite, this Ca10, PO46, OH2, I'm not going to ask you about this chemistry. right here. But if you look at this PO4, that's phosphate. So this is calcium phosphate at some level. That calcium phosphate, when you break it apart, you take the calcium, the 10 elements of calcium, and you put it into the blood, you get a lot of calcium. Then in the process of breaking that down, you also get some phosphorus or phosphates. What can you use those phosphate for? Well, what do you need it? Do you need it for making cell membranes? Do you need it for ADP production? You can use it for a number of different things. So we can recycle this. So your body is making, is taking hydroxyapatite, putting it into the blood, taking calcium from the blood, putting it into the bone. And we're going to talk about that process on a continual basis. Now, what happens if the bone is the chemistry is inaccurate or isn't appropriate? So that if this part right here this is a normal bone, and we're just worried about collagen now. So this looks like a normal bone, and this looks like a normal bone, but if you then take it and there's not enough collagen in it, what happens? It's strong, but it's brittle. That's not a good thing. What happens if there's not enough hydroxyapatite, or this inorganic portion of it? It's shaped the same way, but you can put it into a pretzel. Not a good thing.
So like, I know that like when people get older, like they get like more brittle bones. Is that because of less collagen, or is that something different?
So that's something different. It might be due to less collagen, but it's also due to other processes. That's something we'll talk about tomorrow.
Okay.
And that process of aging and weakening of bones is called osteoporosis. So this, the bone matrix right here on the right-hand side, you see this is a carpal bone that is, or a metacarpal rather, that's bent. That's one that's lacking any of the hydroxyapatite, and this one is the normal one, right? So this calcium hydroxide is one chemical, hydroxyapatite's another. CaPO4 is the calcium phosphate that I mentioned a minute ago. I'm not going to ask you about chemistry and balancing the equations, but I do ask you to recognize these things. Calcium salts, another example of calcium salts here, or a thing that our body needs. CaCO3, this calcium carbonate. That carbonate will help us maintain blood pH and other things. So that is another chemical. So you need to recognize these things, and I can ask you, what would CaCO3 be used for? Calcium carbonate could be used for maintaining calcium levels in the blood, or bone, or calcium levels in the bone. Once again, if it lacks the calcified portion of the bone, if the bone lacks that calcified portion of the matrix, it's normal but too flexible. If it doesn't have enough collagen, it looks normal but it's too brittle. Oh yeah, put your phone away. Can you take your headphones out?
Yeah.
I talked about osteoclasts and osteoblasts and osteocytes. So the first group of cells that we're going to talk about are osteoblasts, and then if you look at the bottom here, osteocytes. So the process of making new bone is called ossification. Right? It starts with cartilage, and we'll get into that details later on. But if Finn and I are walking down the hallway, and I can't see her, and she can't see me, and we're measuring something, right? And I'm walking a little bit faster than her, eventually we're gonna turn, right? Because I'm walking faster than her, right? Now, I'm gonna be, so we're gonna turn, and that's not good before that would happen. If you look on the right-hand side, here's an example of that happening with bone cells. Bone cells on the lateral portion of the bone growing too rapidly compared to the medial portion of the bone. So here's the tibia and the fibula growing more rapidly, the tibia and the fibula growing less rapidly. What happens there? The bones are imperfect. That's called osteogenesis imperfecta. Osteogenesis imperfecta. This is in an infant, and I don't know what the sort of the overall outlook for this individual is, but it's very, very painful. The whole process of bone formation is called ossification. It starts with cartilage, and particularly hyaline cartilage, and is driven by osteoblasts. I said that there's 3 parts of bones. There's the bone matrix, there's the collagen or the bone protein, and then bone cells. So now we're talking about the 3rd part, the bone cells. So when the bone cells aren't working correctly, then we get something like this. That process of osteogenesis or ossification is really all we're talking about here is that these bone cells are producing these fibers and this other stuff. And they make it in the cell, and then they spit it out. What's that called? Exocytosis. What are some of the things that it's going to make? Well, in one case, it's going to make some collagen and other fibers, and in another case, it's going to make the bone salts. The bone salts are going to be laid out in a particular way, and that's going to help with rigidity. And what are some of the bone salts? Well, one example of that is the hydroxyapatite. So it's stored in vesicles and released through exocytosis. So again, now these are for osteoblasts. As the bones get bigger and bigger, so now for Caden, for Mrs. Gaspar's son, his osteoblasts are working like crazy, but now as his bones get longer and longer, some of the osteoblasts are going to get surrounded, and as they get surrounded, are now osteocytes. Those osteocytes are then responsible for maintaining the bone in that area. Right? In other words, in this particular area, and they reside in the lacunae. The osteoblasts that are in the periphery, either in the proximal epiphysis or the distal epiphysis, they're going to be responsible for adding new bone, and they're going to be coordinating with chondroblasts and adding new cartilage, and that's going to be bone lengthening or making bone more strong. So depending on where we are here, we're talking about osteoblasts or osteoclasts, making new bone, converting cartilage into bone, and that's called ossification. The processes that we're talking about here is basically, it's either protein synthesis at the top, that collagen is produced by the rough ER and the Golgi apparatus and then released. And then there's also some other chemistry associated with hydroxyapatite, or the calcium phosphate. Those 2 cells, that is to say osteoblasts and osteoclasts, are related. They, one derives from another, right, and they're good. The osteoclast is a different bone. When we were little, all of us had paddles. We didn't have any fingers, and at some point we had to have cells that were growing from this little paddle right here. We had to have cells that were growing this way, and then we needed to get rid of some cells, and that's called cell death, right, or apoptosis. So we needed to get some cells, we didn't need to get rid of some stuff. These things, osteocytes, osteocytes are I'm sorry, I'm going on to something else. Osteocytes are, I didn't even read this, the slide here. Osteocytes are these mature bone cells. If you look at this, did you see that? I just tripped. Did you see this part right here? Here's the bone, this bone matrix right here. This cell right here, this lacunae, is an osteocyte. So if you find a cell residing in an area right here, that's an osteocyte. There are a series of canals that are help this osteocyte in this lacunae. These canals are called canaliculi, and these canals connect to bigger canals. So there's little canals connect to bigger canals and so on. It's sort of a network there. It is a network. The space is where the osteocyte reside, and what happens with these canals, here you get nutrients that are going to the bone cells, because these bone cells have to survive and thrive. So they're going to be helping make new bone and maintain the bone in this area. All right, so this is the osteocytes, and this is the one that I was thinking of, osteoclasts. So osteoclasts are fundamentally different. Their job is to consume bone. Their job is to break down bone and to get rid of it. So that there are places where in our bodies where we have things that are sticking off of the bone, and other places where there are holes in our bones. There's foramen, foramina, etc. Where do you want holes in the bone? Your body is deciding where those holes are. The medullary cavity is one example of that, other foramen. how do you get that? Well, there's things that are called osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are designed to break down bone. They make acids and other enzymes that digest bone. What is one of the things that digest? They'll digest the collagen. They'll break down the collagen and take the amino acids from the collagen and bring it somewhere else. They'll also, if you see this part right here, the hydrogen ions or this acid is pumped into the matrix of the bone, that hydroxyapatite, that calcium phosphate. That acid then will break apart that calcium phosphate and will break it into in individual ions, and it'll release the calcium. As it releases the calcium, right, then calcium then goes into the blood. So osteoclasts are doing something different. They're doing something absolute opposite to what the osteoblasts and osteocytes are doing. Osteoclasts are a type of leukocyte. They're a type of white blood cell. They're weird. They don't fight infection, but they're a type of white blood cell, and they're involved in hematopoiesis, right? They're a product of hematopoiesis. Another thing that is weird about osteoclasts is that they're multinucleate. So they have several nuclei in there, and so I told you earlier on when we were talking about chapter 3 that cells have a single nucleus. Here's an example of where I was wrong. I like to say I was lying to you, but there's several examples throughout the semester. I'll tell you where that's not true. This is the first case where we have multinucleate cells, and what these things do, what these osteoclasts do, is they crawl along the surface of the bone, and they, on the left-hand side we have a drawing of it, on the right-hand side we have an actual picture of it. This sealed compartment right here is bone matrix right here, and it's releasing its either enzyme or acids onto the bone. In the process of releasing that through exocytosis, the bone gets digested. Here is the bone itself. The bone is getting digested, and then it's getting incorporated into the cell, and then it'll be released. Or it'll get released from that sealed compartment. So this osteoclast is something fundamentally different than that, and if you can imagine, there's a whole bunch of these osteoclasts right in this area right here. It's not hard to see if you sort of have a coordinated way to do it. You can make a foramen or a foramina pretty easily. So there's 3 different types of cells, 2 that are related, 1 that's fundamentally different, and they have different jobs. Okay?
So the red stuff on the picture, that's the bone matrix.
This is the bone matrix.
Okay.
That's right. And this is the bone matrix. All right, so it is, let me see here, 9:35. I want to take a break. So it's 9:37. So how about we take 10-minute break? So